In today's video, let's figure out what could be causing your Midea washer to have the E3 error code. This is an error code that shows up when your lid lock is not working in some way, and the solutions are fairly straightforward to figure out, I think. The tools that we want to use to fix this is a Phillips head screwdriver, a multimeter, and then a magnet. One simple consideration when starting to figure out this code is the lock housing itself. Is there any debris in it? Also ensure that the lid is flush against the top of the washing machine when it's closed. There's a magnet inside the lid top that triggers the lock to cycle off and on, and if it's not fully seated, this could cause your code. Now, if none of those easy tips solve your issue, let's go ahead and open up the unit to test the lid lock. The first step is to unplug the washing machine and access the back of the unit. You'll need to remove any water hoses in the drain hose and keep them suspended, and shut off the water supply, of course. Next, there are two screws at the rear of the machine that need removed by using a Phillips head screwdriver, one on the left side, one on the right side. Then back at the front of the washing machine, make sure that the machine is kind of close to a wall for this next step. One thing you want to do at this point is put tape on the washer lid because the lid's going to move upwards and it could flop and hit the wall behind it or the console top, which would not be good, and I would suggest painter tape for this step. To remove the lid, you need to pull the washing machine top towards you, then up, and that will allow the lid to pivot up and away from the machine to a wall behind the machine. You could hold onto the pivoting lid against the top so it doesn't fly backward if you didn't put tape on it as well. When pivoting the lid though, make sure to pay careful attention to the impact switch on the left corner. It often likes to restrict you when moving the lid both away and towards the machine during the service. Once you have the lid up, you can use a piece of wood or a metal rod to keep the lid upright and secure. We need to access the front of the lid for testing with both of our hands, and the upper right corner of the lid is going to be the switch assembly. The cover has 3 Phillips head screws that need removed to reveal the actual lid switch assembly system. Once you have the cover off, you're going to see 2 primary pieces to the lid switch assembly, the black lid lock and the white magnetic switch that has the smaller yellow wire. Both of these units are held in by screws independently of each other, along with the 2 separate wire harnesses. Let's start to remove the lock first. Use the Phillips screwdriver to remove the 2 screws that hold the switch into place. Then you can remove it from its housing. The wire harness is held in by a small retainer, and the clip will need pressed in a little bit to fully remove it from the casing. The magnetic switch is kind of difficult to remove, but very important to test, as it could also be a fault. Use a small Phillips head screwdriver to remove the screw. It's so small I actually just used the top of a Phillips head bit to remove it from the housing, and then once you have it out, you can separate it from the wire harness like you see here. For the magnetic switch, it could possibly fail if a magnet up close will not trigger its internal mechanism. To test this, set a multimeter to continuity or ohms resistance. Take the leads of the multimeter and press them into the harness wherever metal is. It could be at the front of the harness or just behind where the wires plug in. Then connect the switch to any strong magnet. As the switch gets close to this magnet, it should switch from showing open loop to showing some form of continuity, about 0.0 ohms. If you cannot get this switch to trigger with a magnet, it's the cause of the issue and it needs replaced. As a reminder, the lid does have a magnet inside of it at or near the switch location, so you want to test the switch still assembled to the housing if in case you think this could be the issue, but the magnetic switch tested okay. The lid itself could be damaged in some way, or there could be an obstruction preventing the cycling of the magnetic switch, and you could test it since the top is off right now. If the switch was bad, you need to replace it with a new one, and I will have a link to the replacement magnetic switch in the description. To install it, you'll need to place the magnetic switch onto the housing and then reinstall the screw. Again, there's not a lot of room to do this, so I'm just using that Phillips bit from a screwdriver. Next, to test the lid switch itself, the white lock should be able to be pressed in and out of the housing without any obstruction. Then take your multimeter and insert the leads to the lid switch. There are 4 wires on it. Blue to blue should have between 30 and 60 ohms of resistance if it is in good working order. If you use the multimeter on the pair of black wires, it should show OL when the bar is fully extended, and then show continuity of between 50 and 80 ohms of resistance when it's pressed into the switch housing. And if you get an OL symbol when it's pressed in, then the switch is bad and needs replaced. If the lid lock fails any of these tests, you would need to replace it. I'll have a link to this one too in the description of the video. Both of these switches are rather cheap, and it may be advisable to go ahead and replace both of them at the same time if one has happened to fail through your multimeter tests, since most of your cost is actually, I think, going to be the shipping on this. To reinstall the lock, mount it into the location that was at. There's 2 pegs that it rests on, and reinstall the 2 Phillips screws. Make sure the wire harness is clipped in and secured into place in the housings. Once the switches are back in place, reinstall the plastic cover that guards the switches. There are 3 screws here that need installed. Once that's done, you can lower the lid of the machine to test and make sure everything's working properly. Just make sure to watch out again for that impact switch in the back left corner. It can get caught on the tub when you're trying to reinstall the lid. To install the lid in place, make sure it's flush against the sides of the washing machine, then press backwards to lock the top into place. It can take a little bit of maneuvering to perfectly line it up in place due to the impact switch. There are some screws that are on the chassis of the unit that the lid will maneuver down and slide into place backwards, as you see here, locking the top. You can then test the unit with the lid on to see if you still get the E3 error code. If you've solved it, you can go ahead and reinstall the 2 screws to the rear of the unit, but let's say that didn't fix it. Let's go to a few other things. Remember that the lid has a magnet in it, and you could put another replacement magnet to see if it resolves the code. If so, the lid magnet's bad and you need either a new washer lid or simply glue a new magnet on the outside of the lid like you see in this little picture here. If none of that solved the issue, it's possibly a control board has failed or a wire to the control board is broken. To figure this one out, you'll need to get to the control board to test or replace. You need to remove all the screws that you see here on the back of the washing machine. Once you have the screws off, remove the 2 screws on the left side of the machine where the board is hiding. You'll lift up on the board and out of its housing once these screws are removed. Once you have the housing, it will have 2 or 3 more screws that hold the cover in place. You'll need to remove those and then press on the edges of the board to flip the top off to access the wires. Once you have the board exposed, you can test the wires to the lid switch. They're CN4 and CN12 to control the door lock system. You'd want to remove the wires from the board and test CN4 number 1 to CN12 number 1 with the lid open and then closed. The same would go for the black switch being pressed in and out for wire 2 to see if either of these will get continuity between the wires in those states. If it cycles between open loop and some sort of continuity about 0.00 ohms, that would tell you that the wiring was fine and not the issue, and it would rule the board as being the problem. But if you couldn't get a signal in one of these modes, it's possible that the wiring could be bad from the board to the lock, and you would have to go in and look to see if maybe a wire has been frayed, especially in that dumb cluster of wires in a bag that I've had issues with on other units. But if it happens to be the board, I will have a link to it in the description, and it will vary from model to model depending on your Midea washer to get the right board. Hopefully these ideas did help you out to understand how to fix the E3 error code on your Midea washer. Again, this will work for Insignia, Criterion, or some other Midea built brands. There's a few different names on these Chinese built washers, but I hope this video helps you and you have a wonderful day.